Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, let me take this opportunity on behalf of my colleagues Sarah and Claire to extend a very warm welcome to you all. Some of you will already know me, but for those that don't, my name is Prue Plumridge, and I am one of the 5 founding members of the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies. It's really a great pleasure to see old friends and new faces in the audience. And we're also delighted to welcome our esteemed guests, Bill Mitchell, Warren Mosler, and Martin Watts. Thank you all for coming. Barely 4 years ago, Deborah Harrington, one of the founding members, and I organised a panel event in London at which Bill was a keynote speaker. For those of you that don't already know, that small acorn grew its first roots over the next couple of years, and in 2018 inspired a small group of women to set up the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies, which was launched last year in London. We are now, as of 30th of April, a fully fledged, not-for-profit organisation. And even though sometimes we still have to pinch ourselves to check we're not dreaming, we are pleased to be playing a role, however small, in changing the economic narrative in the UK. We are not economists, and neither do we have academic backgrounds, but we share a common aim, and that is to promote a better understanding of how money works and show that economics has higher priorities than balancing books. In that aim, we are truly grateful for the support of our advisory board, whose appointment was announced in February at the first European MMT conference in Berlin. And also all those committed MMTers working tirelessly on social media platforms, who are also playing an important part in disseminating knowledge about how money really works. From private chat rooms and Google groups, MMT has now exploded into the public domain, initiating a much-needed conversation which admittedly has raised the hackles of some, but ultimately is where all change will start. It is very encouraging. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Warren Mosler. Warren has spent the last 25 years promoting the MMT School of Thought and is the author of The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, published in 2010. More recently, he co-authored Maximising Price Stability in the Market Economy with Professor Damiano Silippo, which was published in the Journal of Policy Modelling. So, Warren, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and wonderful to see all of you out here. And I want to congratulate all the organizers on doing what they've done. And I'd go on and on about it, but I've got 30 minutes, so can't. They didn't give me time for that. I also saw on the title that it said this was going to be about the MMT white paper, which it is, but I didn't say that specifically. So there is an MMT white paper that I put out, and I'll just start with the beginning, which is the most important part. MMT alone recognizes that the U.S. government and its agents are the only supplier of that which it demands for payment of taxes. Okay, so all the money to pay taxes comes from the government, or else it's what's called counterfeit. The government or its agents. Commercial banks are agents of the government. There we go. And that means things like crowding out private spending or private borrowing, driving up interest rates, federal funding requirements, solvency issues are not applicable for a government that spends first and then collects its own tickets later. Okay, so this is be forward and backwards. Okay. So what we can't answer is the most important thing, which is your starting point, which is what do you want? What does a country want? The UK, the United States. And I just have a list of things that are generally assumed that the nation wants. Okay, but I was just talking to a gentleman here who's looking at Cuba, and you can't make those assumptions necessarily that that's what the Cuban government wants. It might, but you can't. So from what MMT is, it's a description of monetary operations, and it can also give you insight on how to get the results that you want from your policy, your inputs. Okay, so, and at the bottom, if the real resources are already there, it can happen. Now I begin with this little story of Pompeii. My wife and I were visiting Pompeii about 4 years ago, and we were on a guided tour, and we were somewhere around there, and the guide showed us these coins that they found in the streets, or what would have been in somebody's pocket, or a merchant's place of business. And he said it was a very nice place to live. They had very nice public services. What they did was they'd hire people for public safety and public sanitation and the aqueducts or whatever, and they would pay them, excuse me, they would collect taxes from everybody, okay, these coins, and then they would hire people to do all the public service, and then they would pay the people. And even though there were high taxes, people liked to live there. And I said to him, being a little bit of a troublemaker, I said, look, the way it worked was that they would pay the people first and then collect the tax. Okay, this is a core MMT principle, right? And he goes, no, you collect the tax and then you pay the people. So I said, well, where did the coins come from? He says, well, the government made them. So I go, well, how did anybody get a coin to pay the tax? He says, so you pay them first and then collect it? And I go, yeah, how else can it work? And he goes, no. Walks away. Okay, I'll guarantee you everybody in Pompeii knew that the government would spend first and then collect the coins later. I got a preview of the next slide here. Interesting. This technology is overrunning me. Okay, so the fundamentals are, and these are outlined in the white paper, the funds to pay taxes and buy bonds come only from the state. I've already said this 4 times. Okay, if you don't take anything else home, they're spending first. Okay, well, where's the money going to come from for this? They're spending it first. The question is, where are the taxpayers going to get the money to be able to meet their tax liability? Not where's the government going to get the money. Okay, therefore, the state from inception spends or lends first, and then taxes can be paid. To repeat one more time. Therefore, state spending is not constrained by revenues. Right? I mean, does anybody think that the movie theater collects the ticket first and then sells it? No. Okay, you sell the ticket first and then you collect it. Okay. The money story has to begin somewhere. And for purposes of understanding today's currency, we start with the state that desires to provision itself. You'll hear other people start money stories, textbooks, about people living on an island, bartering, and then they start coming up with a coin. And maybe they did, I don't know, I wasn't there. But that is not illustrative of how things happen today. To start today's money story, you start with a state desiring to provision itself. All right? And what the state needs is soldiers for defense, it needs public health, it needs public education, it needs a legal system. How do you get people out of the private sector, out of whatever they were doing, into the public sector? Pompeii needed people to do all this work. How do you get people off the street to do the public service? Okay, and so the first step is to impose a tax liability payable in the currency, in the state's currency, which becomes the tax credit. The currency is the thing needed to pay taxes. That's what a tax credit is. Okay, so you impose a tax liability in dollars. You impose a tax liability in pound sterling. What have you just done? Okay, you've changed things. Pompeii imposed a tax liability in their coins. Everybody's had to pay so many coins a month, or else they're going to lose their house. They're going to go up for public auction. They have suddenly created people looking for work that's paid in that coin. Before that tax liability, nobody cared about the coin. They didn't even know there was one. But after this tax liability, suddenly you're aware that you've got an obligation. And it doesn't have to be everybody. It only has to be a few people. But you've got this, absolute obligation to pay this thing, and it's coercive. They're going to sell your house if you don't pay it, right? What we have created is sellers of services, goods and services, looking for paid work. That's called unemployment. So when the state imposes a tax liability, the purpose by design of that thing is to create unemployment, people looking for paid work, for the further purpose of being able to hire them. Okay, so you have a tax liability, results in sellers of goods and services, which is unemployment, okay, seeking the state's currency. The state then can make its purchases in its otherwise worthless currency. There's no value to these things apart from that. Okay. Taxes are paid now, okay? People come to work, you pay them. Now the economy has the money to pay the tax and buy bonds if the state happens to be selling bonds. Now in Pompeii, they didn't sell bonds. Okay, what happened was they found something like 20,000 coins in the street. How did they get there? Okay, what happens to state spending? After the state spends, the private sector has only two choices as a whole. Use the money to pay taxes, in which case it's removed from the economy, or don't use the money to pay taxes, maybe buy something from somebody else, leave it in your pocket, okay? In which case it remains in the economy until someone uses it to pay taxes. So Pompeii had all these people show up for work, for public service. They paid them all. Turns out they paid them more than was enough to pay their tax bill. People were willing to earn more coins on overall than the tax bill. Like, why would they do that? Well, they wanted coins in their pockets. The merchants wanted to be able to transact and make change. Who knows? But they did. And we know they did because we found 20,000 coins in the street. And the only way they could have gotten there is if the state, the city, had spent more than it collected. Simple point of logic. Okay? Those coins in the street are the public debt. They spent more than they collected. That's the public debt. Okay. Today, the UK spends a certain amount, let's say 100, maybe 90 are paid in taxes, and the other 10 remain in the street. It's a public debt. Okay, they're liabilities of the state. The state owes you the right to keep your house if you pay those things in taxes, right? That's why accountants call them liabilities. They have an obligation to you to accept these to release you from your tax penalty, whatever the penalty for non-payment is. Right? So Pompeii did not then sell bonds to give these people with 20,000 coins a place to invest. It never occurred to them to do that. Why would they? Okay, the UK does, the US does, Japan does. We don't have to ask why they do. But it's left over from at best, you can say it's left over from the gold standard, but it's another story. But today, it's not an applicable thing to do, and we'll get into that later. Okay, so what is the public debt? The public debt is the funds spent by the state that have not yet been used to pay taxes. Okay, it constitutes what can be best thought of as a net money supply in the economy. All those coins in the street were the money supply in Pompeii. Okay, the 22 trillion of public debt in the U.S. is the money in the street in the U.S. The U.S. spent 22 trillion more than came back and that was paid in taxes. It's kept. What is the street? What do we mean by kept on the street today? What we mean is it's kept in bank accounts. Some in cash, but mostly in bank accounts. Which bank accounts specifically do we mean? We mean bank accounts at the central bank. What are those bank accounts called? They're called reserves and treasury securities, gilts, U.S. Treasury bonds. Those are just bank accounts at the central bank. You give them money, you get it back with interest. It's a central bank. The money is in a bank account. Okay, so we don't keep it out on the street. We keep it in bank accounts. But it's the same thing. Okay, and okay, so a growing economy has a growing money supply. Does that surprise anybody? Okay. Move on to unemployment. Another MMT fundamental insight, although others have talked about it, but not recently. But taxation by design causes unemployment. We've already reviewed that. It was a tax that caused people to seek paid work to get that currency. Unemployment, therefore, what is that? People looking for work who can't find a job. Okay, that's the evidence that the state has not spent enough to cover the need to pay taxes. They create a tax liability. It creates a certain need to pay taxes. It also creates a desire to save. Once you know this is the money the state wants for taxes, you want to save a few. So the tax creates two things: a need to pay the tax and a desire to save. Okay, it hasn't spent enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the desire to save. Another way to say the same thing: if the state doesn't spend enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the desire to save, the evidence is unemployment. As Bill will talk later, unemployment is caused by the state. Okay, it's deliberate policy, whether they know it or not. They've done it. It wouldn't be there if not for what they've done. It's not something that happens in nature that we're trying to reverse the natural order of things. This is something that's created by a simple monetary system. So how do you reverse the unemployment? Because it's a mistake. If the U.S. government knew it only was going to hire 5 million people, why would it impose a tax that creates 10 million unemployed? That doesn't make any sense. If Pompeii had too many people coming to work after they put the tax on, they didn't need all these people, what would they do? Okay, there's two things you can do. You can hire them. They can always do that. They're not going to run out of money. They had a big coin box to pay these people. The United States just credits your account. The UK just credits your account. So all these extra unemployed you created, you could hire them, have second thoughts and say, you know what, there is a lot more we'd like the public sector to do. We need more public services. Or you can lower the tax, in which case they'll go away. Because the only reason they're there is because the need to pay tax and the desire to save. Okay? So the state has those two options. But there's one more problem. Once you've created unemployment and you've hired the ones you want and you haven't hired the rest, you've damaged those people. They can't just go back and get another job. And studies have shown that employers strongly prefer to hire somebody already working. They don't like to hire people who've been unemployed. There's too much risk. You don't know if they're going to be on time every day, or if they're going to get in fights, or they're on drugs, or you just don't know. And so you don't know if they get along with other people, or their work ethics. So you're willing to train them if they're good, and you're willing to bring them on, but you don't want to take a chance having somebody who's just out. So you'd rather hire somebody already working, even if you have to pay a little extra. And this has been demonstrated over and over again. And so, yes, we can lower the tax and have fiscal expansion to try and get business good, and so hopefully these employers will hire the unemployed, but they don't. And especially in Europe, you get very high what they call hysteresis, where every cycle the amount of unemployed that can't get jobs goes up and up because they're damaged goods economically. All right, and so what do we do about that? How did I say it here? Okay. What we do is offer a job to anybody willing and able to work, okay, that has a certain JG wage, which is a reasonable wage, and that, by the way, becomes the minimum wage in the economy. So it establishes because nobody could pay less than that because people will take this job. So it does it automatically. You don't have to have minimum wage legislation with investigators and all that. So we offer a job to anybody willing and able to work, and now they're employed. Now, and we've done this to promote the transition from unemployment, which is public sector. The government's taking you out of the private sector with its taxation, from unemployment back to private sector employment. Okay, so first, of course, the public sector properly provisions itself. It's got all these unemployed. Hire whatever you need to get the public services you want. But if there's anybody left over, you don't want to be doing nothing. You want to transition them back into the private sector. Okay, now there may be some people, even with a government job, don't want to go back to the private sector. Fine. No problem there. And, some people will say, well, then it's not a transition job. Well, it is. They're available for work. They're earning a wage. If the private sector can't attract them at a higher wage, the private sector is going to have to try harder because they like what they're doing and they want to do it. I don't have any problem with that. But still, the purpose of this program is to provide for the transition into the private sector. Okay? And again, it's after properly provisioning the public sector. Okay? And so what we have here is critical to a lot of people who might not agree with a lot of other things. The job guarantee provides a superior price anchor versus unemployment. The reason we have the unemployed today is they're used to keep inflation down. You get a lot of unemployment, you conduct policy to make unemployment go up because you're worried about inflation and you think that'll bring inflation down. They're competing with other workers, they keep wages from going up, and demand goes down because they're making less money, and so we use unemployment to help keep prices from going up. But how effective are they in preventing wages from going up too much, whatever that means? Okay, if the people can't be hired, if the government doesn't want to hire them. Okay, it's like having, and Bill might talk later about a buffer stock of wool, which is where he started, and you've been buying wool because the price goes down, then when the price goes up, you go to sell it out in the market, but it's all rotted. Okay, it's not going to work and that's what happens with unemployment. But when people are working, now you've kept your wool in tip-top condition, you've kept the butter fresh, whatever your buffer stock is, you've kept your labor ready for work, and now it's an effective price anchor. And that's the paper I wrote that was published in a leading mainstream journal about how this employed buffer stock is a superior price anchor than unemployment, and therefore the European Central Bank should fund it to meet their inflation targets. Okay, so very important to know these aspects of the job guarantee. These are the core monetary aspects. Okay, so what would our proposals today, or my proposals today? It's all, proposals are always personal, of course. How do we do here? Number one, I would increase the annual deficit by 5% of GDP as a starting point. I think there's at least 5% slack in the economy, probably 10 or 15. 5% is a good starting point. Once you see it's working, then you can go on from there and fill it up. So that would either be a tax cut, so people would have more money to spend if you wanted more private sector GDP, maybe eliminate value-added tax or something like that. And then, or you could increase public services, properly fund national health, rails, whatever else you wanted, research, you name it, infrastructure. Those are political choices. You're going to have left and right discussing those, but coming up with something that adds up to 5% of GDP. Use fiscal policy then to sustain full employment. By full employment, we're going to have a job guarantee, which is a form of full employment. It's not necessarily everybody's definition of it, but what you've done is offered a job to anybody looking for work, and once that's happened, you can say that's a form of full employment. But then that size of the JG pool, to get them to transition, you have to have an economy that wants to hire them. You then have to either lower taxes or increase public spending to make sure that number is kept to a minimum. And that minimum should be less than, a lot less than today's unemployment, because it's a better buffer stock. So if the minimum unemployment, not that there is one, because I can argue that there is no such thing, but is 5%, maybe this gets you down to 2%, or some frictional level where people are going to be unemployed as they're changing jobs and that type of thing. Okay. Sustain a permanent zero interest rate policy. You look at all the coins in the street of Pompeii, they didn't earn interest. It was a zero interest rate policy. There was no inflation because of that or anything else. Japan's had a zero interest rate policy for 30 years with only a brief period of maybe 0.25%. They're still fighting deflation. The European Union, European Central Banks got negative rates. They're not causing any inflation. It doesn't work that way. So you don't do that. And once you have a zero rate policy, then there's no interest paid on government bonds. So which, while it can be used as a policy tool, which I won't discuss now, what government interest payments I call basic income for people who already have money. When the government raises rates, they're paying out more interest to people who already have money in the form of government bonds, and it pushes up the whole interest rate spectrum, which is for people who already have money. To me, that doesn't suit me politically as a way to spend money into the economy, by just giving more money to people who already have a lot of money. But that's just me. Okay. Adequately fund public services, investment, and research. I'm going to do a quick word on where the price level comes from and where inflation comes from, and why with a zero interest rate policy you still don't get inflation in Japan. What was a coin worth in Pompeii? Well, it depends on what you have to do to get it from the issuer. It's a monopoly. Monopolists set price. So if the government of Pompeii, the state, said we're going to pay 1 coin a day, what's that coin worth? It's worth whatever 1 day's labor is worth to everybody. I mean, what's it worth? What's it worth in the marketplace? Would you rather be a police officer for a day, or would you rather grow tomatoes and raise chickens and sell them to police officers? You know, there's some relative value that goes on there. So let's say a coin was worth 1 day's labor, and that was worth 10 tomatoes in the marketplace. Right. That ratio doesn't change unless the government changes what it pays to the police officers and the sanitation workers. As long as it's paying one, those things will be worth a day's labor forever. It's not going to change. Nobody has any say in that. The monopolist sets the price. What if the government says, oh, we're going to give everybody a raise, we're going to pay 2 coins a day? Well, fine. Now a coin's only worth half a day's labor. Now it's only worth 5 tomatoes. All they've done is cut the value of the money in half. They used to call that crying down the currency, okay? That's all they did, was cut it in half. The currency is worth what you have to get it from the issuer. It's got nothing to do with inflation expectations and rates and demand and all that. It's what you have to do to get it. They've got it, and you need it, or you're going to lose your house. Here's what it's worth. And then in a market economy, at least in theory, you only have to set one price, and the rest is reflected as relative value in the marketplace, what it's worth versus other things. And that'll change with scarcity and all kinds of other things. And there's all kinds of institutional structure out there that'll cause that to change, laws on what you can do. But generally, that's a good guideline as what it'll be worth. Okay. Bank of England, process payments, 0% rate, provide unlimited bank deposit insurance. Shouldn't be limited to £80,000. It's not a single good reason I've ever heard for that. Okay, it just causes more expense for the banks as they got to go out with all this effort to do things. But if you have the next one, provide unlimited bank liquidity through the Bank of England, then you certainly don't have to worry about any problems from unlimited deposit insurance. But then once the banks have unlimited ability to fund themselves, you've got to regulate and supervise the asset side, what they can do for lending. And I have a very narrow banking proposal as what they can actually do with the when they make loans. Okay, so once you've guaranteed the deposits, which is already the case, now the banks have public money, it's state funds, and if you don't regulate them properly, you get all kinds of moral hazard, as we've seen in the past. And if you say you can't, you don't have enough regulators, then you can't let them do it. You have to just eliminate all lending facilities until you're in a position to adequately supervise them and regulate them. Otherwise, it's like giving the military guns and bullets, but we haven't established the officers and the rules for the military. You can't do that. You can't have these people running around, fully armed without rules. Okay. And the monetary policy that would follow this is government spending remains in member bank and BOE accounts, so there's no government securities, which is pretty much how the U.S. and Japan has done that almost entirely. It doesn't create any problems. It just makes things easier, cuts down on expenses. It's just more efficient. And the Bank of England should fund the job guarantee and supervise it because it's an anti-inflation tool. And they've got plenty of people working there now who are going to have a lot less to do. This will give them something a lot more important to do. Uh-oh, is there anybody here from the bank? Okay. Because if there was, I'd have to dumb this down a lot more for you. Okay. Fiscal policy. Simple. You target output and employment goals. The deficits are residual. You don't even have to publish a number. Nobody should care. Nobody will care. Okay. With a permanent zero rate policy, there's no interest payments. You don't need to know what the public debt is. It doesn't enter into any calculation. It's just a residual calculation to make sure you didn't make a mistake with your arithmetic. Trade. This will be the last part. Okay. Exports are real cost, things you send out. Imports are the benefits, the things you get in. think of your real wealth as your pile of stuff. The pile is this big from everything you produce domestically. It gets this big when you import. And it goes down when you export. Okay, so the imports are the benefits, the exports the cost. And that, what's left over is your real wealth. So you want to optimize that. Okay, when somebody's army conquers another country, the loser has to send things to the winner. Okay, the winner doesn't say, oh, we want to be an export power, we're going to conquer somebody and export to them, and so we're the winners. That doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, and so, lost my train of thought. So, okay, and so the other question that comes up is they wonder, like, what if nobody trades with us because if we do this, we have export, what if we import too much or whatever, have an export surplus? And that's total nonsense. Okay, what does the UK produce nowadays? Is there some product here I'm trying to come up? Something, right? What's that? Aggregates? Materials. Okay, so you take a barge full of aggregates, right? I've got one of those back home, by the way. Okay, and you send it over to Rome or something, okay? And then it exchanges for so many Ferraris, right? And there's a market, a world market for that. So many lira, so many euros for this, so many liras for that, and you'll get, this barge will trade for 10 Ferraris or whatever. Are they going to say, well, because England's unemployment, the UK's unemployment is too low, and because their, I don't know, the currency went down, we're not going to do that. Of course, they don't care. They don't care if you even have a currency. All right? Those aggregates will exchange for those Ferraris at some ratio, totally independent of anything going on domestically. Right? So when we look at your pile of stuff, the exports go out and the imports come in. That's not going to change. Now, if they've been sending you extra cars because they want to hold your currency, that part could change. It's not particularly large, that could change. And that's what we talk about is optimizing your real terms of trade. You want to be able to get the most for what you send out. But what happens is it creates things that happen in the currency create these massive distributional problems. If the currency goes down or the currency goes up, that affects who has to dig the aggregates and who gets to drive the Ferraris, okay, back in England. Okay, but it doesn't affect the total for the country. And those distributional issues are best dealt with local policy, fiscal policy and all your rules and regulations and everything else, and not by making your pile of stuff smaller. You don't go into an austerity program to bring down the real wealth so that you can alter distribution or alter something like that. It doesn't make any sense to do that. Okay. So your real wealth is everything produced domestically plus imports minus exports. Full employment optimizes real terms of trade and optimizes wealth. So it's critical to keep full employment. The gains you're going to have from full employment will be much larger than any small change that might happen in trade. But again, you've got to mind the distributional issues. Okay, so just a quick review. Government's public infrastructure for public purpose. These are the things we've gone through. The most important one right now is last, job guarantee for anyone willing to work. And I'll leave it to Martin and Bill to fill in any holes I've left. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren, for your insights. I'm sure it'll prove food for thought for all of us. And now moving on to our second speaker, and again a very warm welcome to Professor Bill Mitchell. Bill is a leading proponent of modern monetary theory and director of COFI, the Centre for Full Employment and Equity, promoting research aimed at restoring full employment and achieving an economy that delivers equitable outcomes for all. He has written extensively in the fields of macroeconomics, econometrics, and public policy. His most recent book, jointly authored with Professors L. Randall Wray and Martin J. Watts, was launched in London earlier this year and followed the successful launch of Reclaiming the State in 2017. Thank you, Bill, and welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so this gosh, this thing MMT began in around the early 90s. And the sort of partnership when Warren and I met up was about 94, I think. And in different ways we'd been cooking up stuff. And then when we met, the project really began. Warren had done prior work on the monetary side and the banking side. I'd done prior work on other aspects of it, the buffer stock aspects. And my neck's going to go crazy. And that's when the MMT project began. And we used to laugh when we'd meet up that we could count the MMTs on one hand with spare fingers. And it was 2, 3. And Warren recruited some people, and it started from there, and spilled over to 2 hands. And we were really engaged. Warren was engaged in financial markets, and he'd have these annual events where we'd sort of talk to financial market people. And obviously I and Randy were engaged in the academic side. And we were building what I now call a body of work, the principles, and Warren's given a really good introduction to those. And then I remember one day we had a meeting, Randy and Warren and I were there, and I'd just been to an IT seminar because I really like coding and that sort of stuff, and I'd been to an IT seminar announcing the concept of a blog, a weblog, and I announced to the Randy and Warren, can you remember that, Warren? Yep. I said, I'm going to start a blog. And I remember Randy was quite impolite. And by the way, I just love England. I was out running this morning. Come on. I was out running this morning. Polite got me going. And I was up near St Anne's, and there's this sign on the beach, and it says, no barbecues or open flames on the grass area, but it says it's a polite notice. You wouldn't find that in Australia, I can tell you. I just love that, polite notice. Anyway, the move into social media was a very important move, I think, because that started the communication with grassroots people. Because if you've studied philosophy of science, you'll know that trying to get paradigm change in the knowledge communities is very difficult. And trying to deal with my peers in the academic sphere is as I'll explain in a moment, is just riddled with what I call groupthink. And so really MMT is, I think, the first type of... We're in the middle of a paradigm shift, folks. And I think that we've, in terms of the history of economic thought, this is the first paradigm shift that's going to be accomplished by grassroots action. And that's a really significant event, and you're going to be all part of it. And when the historical line is drawn, you're going to be on the right side, unless there's some closets in the room. All right, so that's sort of a bit of an introduction. Check out some of these headlines. Now, this was in Bloomberg, this was in some other, blah, Krugman, Summers, Rogoff, all of the sort of heavy hitters in the mainstream economics in the recent period have really come out and are trying to kill us off. This particular quote here is not a quote, it's wording from a bill that's before the US Senate, where 5 Republican senators have actually proposed a bill which seeks to condemn us because we're a danger to the economy of the United States. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're making progress. But
I know Larry Fink, so I think he did it just to give me a little shot.
Yeah. I mean, I love the one that it's grotesque. I've always fancied I was okay. Okay, so what we're dealing with basically is a resistance. This is all the resistance that's now coming, and paradigm shifts go through stages, and we were ignored for about 20 years while we were cooking up the body of work, and now we're into the stage where we're clearly a threat to the mainstream. More and more people are starting to talk about it. It's infiltrated the political sphere now, and there's champions emerging for these ideas in the political sphere. And once that happens, then there's going to be votes cast for politicians and so on and so forth. And what we're seeing is a mainstream of my profession, which is has a disgraceful history, and a history where they've been blithely unaware of reality for years. And that's what happens in dominant paradigms. And I'm not going to go through all of these things, but these are elements of this blindness. In 2003, a Nobel Prize winner, Robert Lucas Jr., announced to all of us that the business cycle was dead. That we were no longer going to have any more cycles of recession and boom, and that all that government should do was then concentrating on further the microeconomic aspects of life, further deregulation, further movements towards lacking job protections, scrap. Some of the senators that have put that bill before the US Congress want to scrap the EPA, they want to scrap the Inland Revenue Service, they want to scrap the Department of Education, and this is the sort of thing that my profession has been providing authority to, these mad, crazy politicians. And essentially my profession became locked in this bubble, self-reverential bubble, where there is no longer going to be any cycles, where all the main macroeconomic problems had been solved, and where you didn't even have to worry about financial markets. So the dominant framework for macroeconomics is taught in our universities, and which is dominating in central banks and treasury and finance departments, the so-called new Keynesian paradigm, didn't even have a banking or financial sector in its model, which is used for policy analysis. So it wasn't, and that's because they believed in efficient market theory, where whatever the financial markets would do would be optimal. And so it's no surprise they didn't see the GFC coming, because they didn't even have a financial sector. They didn't think it was important. And this just on groupthink. What we're now in the phase of is seeing what Imre Lakatos, who was a famous philosopher of science at LSE, called a degenerative paradigm. And that's a paradigm that's basically lost the plot, but it persists as the dominant paradigm in the area of concern through groupthink. Groupthink's a way in which behaviour of groups becomes patterned, and it has features. This was identified in the social psychology literature in the early 60s, this sort of patterned behaviour. And a sort of mob rule develops where it filters out dissent through various ways, graduate programs. I was telling Warren yesterday that when I was doing my master's work before PhD, a senior professor, Parrish, Martin taught me in that program, by the way. But a senior professor at the university said to me that he said, "I'd advise you to become a sociologist because you're never going to cut it as an economist." And that was a filtering out pressure. And they do it through publications and through grant distribution, through appointments and all the rest of it. And so very few people that have non-mainstream positions come through. Very few of us. And they just deny anything that creates dissonance for them. And so these quotes I had up there are them trying to maintain their degenerative paradigm that's lost its empirical content. That's the jargon. What that means is that it can't provide any insights into what the real world is. And there's a whole lot of basic myths that are taught to students and policymakers rehearse regularly. Government's like a household. Printing money is inflationary. And all these articles that those headlines came from rehearse these myths. That deficits crowd out, fiscal deficits crowd out private initiatives. That you define what's fiscally sustainable by some number of a fiscal deficit. Now, what the next part of this talk is really to provide some more insight into the basic principles that Warren initiated. The mainstream approach is to define fiscal sustainability and fiscal space in terms of a set of financial ratios. Now, that's exemplified here, for example, in the British Labour Party's fiscal credibility rule. Just the terminology gives it away. And in the Eurozone, 3% maximum fiscal deficit and a 60% maximum public debt ratio. As if those have any meaning. Whereas with our approach to macroeconomics, the MMT approach, fiscal sustainability can't be defined in those terms. They have no context and no meaning. And so whenever we're thinking about fiscal sustainability, we have to be considering, well, what's the role of fiscal policy? And that was Warren's first slide. What are the aims of society? Now, MMT can't give you those aims because those aims reflect the collective values of the society. And so a brutal dictatorship running a monetary system will have different aims to a very progressive left society. But you've got to start off with your aims, and fiscal policy isn't there to produce a surplus or a deficit. It's there to achieve, to use the capacity of the currency issuer to move the society through output and service provision to those aims. And so if you've got a society where you've got a private domestic sector, households and firms who want to save overall for a rainy day, and you've got a society that's benefiting from having an external deficit, I repeat that, benefiting from running an external deficit, that follows on from Warren's pile of stuff. And what Warren didn't say is that what the macro of an external deficit means some of the income that's being produced in a period is going to be leaking out of the economy. In return, you're getting this stuff through imports being higher than exports. And if you've got some of the income that's being generated domestically not being recycled back into spending in the next period because the households and firms are desiring to save overall, then you've got a basic macro problem, because if nothing else happens, you'll end up with recession. Because income is being produced by firms on the expectation that they'll be able to sell the stuff. And so if they produce the income one period and it doesn't all come back next period in spending, they'll realise they've made a mistake and they cut back. And so the only way you can get out of that bind, there's only one other sector left, and that's the government sector. And that establishes why typically you'll be running continuous deficits to maintain stable growth and full employment. Typically, when a government runs fiscal surpluses, a recession soon follows. Now, there's some countries that can run fiscal surpluses and satisfy the domestic need to save overall. And that's countries like Norway that have got very strong export revenue coming in. But they're in the minority, extreme minority. So when we talk about fiscal sustainability, the first question you've got to ask yourself is, what do we want to achieve with fiscal policy? And we want to maintain high levels of activity so that nobody becomes unemployed. And that's just a different way of saying what Warren said anyway. Another thing that we need to focus on is this concept of depoliticisation. And I'm not going to go into each of these, but the tendency over the last several decades has been for those in charge of fiscal policy, that is the currency issuing government, to become obsessed with running contractionary fiscal positions and realising that in our democracies that's unpopular because it causes unemployment, it causes loss of services. Tomorrow I'm giving a talk to local government officials in London about the disastrous situation in that austerity's caused local councils, and it's the perfect example here. That what depoliticisation has done under this austerity mindset is that the decision maker pushes the responsibility and the identification of the costs onto an external entity. So in Britain, for example, the local government officials are getting pilloried because libraries are closing and essential programs are being shut down because of the loss of income. But the actual cause is central government. And, you know, Britain is the perfect example of this as well, because of, if those old enough to remember, the mid-70s, when a Labor Chancellor, Dennis Healey, told lies to the British people that the government was just about to run out of money and would have to borrow from the IMF. That was depoliticisation. What he wanted to do, he'd become infested with monetarism. What he wanted to do was impose austerity. He knew it wouldn't be the unions, the wage agreement at the time. He knew that wasn't going to be popular, so he had to invent a story that, we've got no choice. That was the beginning of TINA. Margaret Thatcher didn't invent TINA. Dennis Healey and James Callaghan did.
We lived through it.
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't. What's that?
Yeah.
Now, another thing that we need to get very clear also, and this is both those quotes I showed at the beginning of the critics, but also progressive people who are trying to make sense of our work. I often hear, well, when we have progressives put on Twitter and stuff, well, when we have MMT, things are going to be great. Or Larry Summers says, when we have MMT, if we dare step in and have MMT, it's going to be grotesque and the world will melt. It's as if MMT is some sort of regime that you shift to. Well, ladies and gentlemen, MMT, and I apologise if you're paranoid, MMT is all around us. In our everyday life, we walk the streets and there it is. So you've got to be clear, it's not a regime, it's a lens, what I call a superior lens for understanding the operations of the monetary system, superior to the way in which the mainstream of my profession attempts to construct an understanding of the monetary system, full of myth. And it also allows us to cut through and identify what the actual capacities of the currency issuing government are. And I think this is an incredibly empowering lens, because it cuts through what I call the veil of ideology. Because if everybody has an MMT understanding, that is, that they actually understand the way our system out there operates and what our governments can and can't do and what the consequences of different actions will be, well, then they'll no longer tolerate a politician getting up there and saying, we've got to tolerate 10% unemployment because we'll run out of money. Or we can't deal with climate change because we haven't got enough money. Because if we all understand that that's not true, well, then that smokes them out, doesn't it? Because then the politician has to disclose why they want to have 10% unemployment. And I think that empowers our democracies. And the other thing we've then got to understand is that MMT is relatively agnostic. Well, it's not relative, it's agnostic about policy. And in a way, it's neither right wing or left wing. To operationalise the understanding that MMT provides you, you've got to overlay that understanding with a set of values, with an ideology. And so a real hardcore right-winger who understands MMT would come up with a different set of policy interventions to a left-winger like me with the same monetary understanding. So it just happens that the MMT founders and the core group are relatively progressive. Just happens that. But that doesn't mean that MMT is left. My values are left, but my understanding of the monetary system isn't left. It's knowledge. That's a really important thing to differentiate in when you're talking to people, because there's all these, the resistance that we're getting now, those quotes and that, is not about the core monetary theory that we've provided, because these characters don't even get it. It's about that they think it's left wing. So they're really having a debate about values, and they actually don't understand the distinction. But you all do. What having your currency, and this is just reinforcing what Warren said, what having your own currency means is that the currency issuer can buy whatever is available for sale in that currency, including all idle labour. Once you understand that, then you immediately know the next thing, and that is that any mass unemployment in the economy is a political choice of government. It's not something that's come out of the ether, it's not market driven, and none of all of that's true. It's not because people are lazy, it's because governments have chosen to run net spending positions, deficits, that are too low, or surpluses that are too big. And so once you understand that, then the sort of questions you'll hassle your local politicians with will be different to the questions that you might ask if my profession gets up, as they do, and say, oh, well, what students are taught is that unemployment is a voluntary optimising choice of people between leisure and earning income. That's what's taught to students. And the other important thing is that the fact that the government can buy whatever's available for sale doesn't mean that it should. It all depends. And if it does, then what MMT allows you to tease out is what the consequences of different positions using that capacity will be. We've got music. Briefly, having your own currency doesn't mean that the nation will be richer in material terms. So I often see on Twitter, oh, if we go to MMT, everybody will be better off. Well, not necessarily. A poor country that doesn't have... What MMT says is that the available real resources that you have in the nation, plus those that you can induce from others through trade, can always be fully used and made productive. But what level of output and services that emerge from that may not be deliver very high level standards of material living. Okay, job guarantee and UBI. Warren's already given an introduction. Where we start from is that a currency issuing government has two options in terms of establishing a framework to maintain price stability, that is a steady inflation rate. It can either use unemployment buffer stocks, which is the dominant approach these days, and technical, it's this NAIRU, don't worry about it. Or it can take an MMT path and use an employment buffer stock. Now, Warren mentioned wool. I haven't got time to go into how I came up with this idea that initially, but it related to a wool price stabilisation scheme that the Australian government ran in, where the government would buy and sell wool to stabilise prices so that farmers would have stable incomes in terms of fluctuations in the wool clip. And at the time I was studying agricultural economics, and that sounded like full employment of wool to me. And it was at the time in the late 70s when unemployment was emerging in Australia for the first time. And so I wasn't interested in wool so much other than to keep me warm in winter, but I was interested in the unemployment. And so in the same principle, when the private market's weak, the government can buy the labour, and when the private market becomes stronger again, it'll buy the labour back out again. That's an employment buffer stock. It goes up and down with the cycle. Now, the point is that unemployment buffer stocks is an incredibly costly way in which you can maintain price stability. Yes, it maintains steady inflation rates typically because it disciplines workers from pushing up wages typically, and it creates poor sales conditions that firms can't push up margins. That's sort of the story. But it creates incredible income losses. It's the daily income losses are massive because these people aren't working and producing, but it also has incredibly costly social pathologies. Mental health, crime, substance abuse, family breakdowns, intergenerational disadvantage, go through them. I could list stacks. And the benefits of full employment, of course, are the opposite. It's like a mirror, that individuals now have income stability, they can manage their personal risk profiles, they feel better because if you're working you've got social esteem and you feel as though you're included in society. You typically have pathways to higher skill development. We know that poverty can relieve unemployment. I've been involved in a scheme in South Africa, a public works scheme, which in the first 5 years employed 1 million people, and everybody in that program moved above the poverty line. It was just so obvious. This was a program that the IMF didn't like, obviously. And intergenerational stability is a really important one. If the only thing that happens from a job guarantee is that children grow up seeing their parents go to work each day and don't inherit the disadvantage of being in a jobless household, well then that would be sufficient to justify a job guarantee. All right, so I think Warren's done it, that it's an unconditional offer. You just float a job offer at a minimum wage that's socially inclusive. That doesn't mean a poverty wage. It means that the person who's receiving it can participate meaningfully in society. Go to the theatre, go out to dinner occasionally, go to football matches, whatever. It's not a pittance. It's not just a mere consumption wage. But that sets the minimum wage. And of course, how do you know when you've reached what we call loose full employment, well, it's when nobody else walks through the door asking for a job. That's it. Why is it loose full employment? And Warren mentioned a sort of full employment. Well, it's loose full employment because it doesn't take care of what we call underemployment. So if I lost my job and we had a job guarantee, I'd be down the job guarantee office to get a job. But the reason that it might mismatch my skills is because it has to be inclusive to the most disadvantaged people. And we know that the disproportionate burden of unemployment falls on those who are low skilled and have difficulty anyway engaging in work. Okay, Warren's already mentioned that. The important point here is that the government, a lot of progressives think, well, when you've got unemployment, what the government should do is stimulate the private sector. Now, what they mean, you'll see schemes to have major infrastructure projects and things like that. Well, that's good, but it runs the danger, because you're going to be competing for resources as the level of activity rises at market prices with private demanders for those resources, firms and that. You run the risk of triggering inflation. I call that a generalised Keynesian expansion, but that runs the risk of being inflationary. A job guarantee doesn't compete with any private sector bidders because it buys off the bottom. The unemployed, by definition, have zero bid in the private market because nobody wants them. So you can't be pushing up prices by bidding resources that currently have no bid. You're buying off the bottom. These micro benefits are just a reflection on what the benefits of full employment are. You reduce, Warren's already mentioned it, you reduce private sector hiring costs because people are already in the workforce. Research studies show that when people become unemployed, over time their social network shrinks down to 1. They start to, the psychological processes start to impact upon their ability to manage time. That means that they sleep in and stuff like that. And why wouldn't you? And a whole lot of other things that make it difficult to transition back into the paid workforce. That's all gone. It reinforces intergenerational advantage. One of the significant findings in the social psychology and sociology literature is that children that grow up in jobless households, entrenched joblessness, inherit that disadvantage and become and suffer right through their adult lives. Training, spatial advantages. It means that little villages. I've just been up in St Anne's yesterday. That little village, if there was unemployed people there, they'd get jobs. It's not a cosmo thing, a cosmopolitan thing. It's not that. It can support, it can be an essential part of environmental sustainability because the sort of jobs that would be approved would have to be green, and so on. But don't get the idea that the job guarantee is the bee's knees, that it's the panacea for everything. It's just the first thing a currency issuing government should put in place. And there's a whole lot of other things, public health, public education, Green New Deal, infrastructure, transport, all of that. That's on top of all of this, but this is just the basic thing. People say, well, what's the cost? Well, what does any public program cost? Not the numbers that are in the budget statements. They're meaningless in their own standalone. They don't mean anything. What a policy program costs is the real resources that are consumed by that program. So the extra food that the unemployed might be able to buy, that's a real cost. And so MMT has a different concept of cost. And so when I see politicians say, oh, well, it's going to cost $13 billion, so what? What does that mean? Okay, there's all this stuff about are the jobs real? I mean, the easiest way I think about that is that how many of you have been asked when you go to the supermarket to pay, have you got a real job? I've never been asked that. I've never been asked that. So this idea of a real job is just another ideological way of avoiding governments taking responsibility. And, you know, my research centre has done very large-scale research in Australia of local government agencies, and we've identified hundreds of thousands jobs, which is more than the unemployed, that will meet community need, that will meet environmental care needs, that will never be delivered by our market process, that is a private profit process, which add net social benefits. That's a real job. We're so conditioned to think of productivity in terms of something that adds to private profit, whereas productivity, in the way I think about it, adds to social profit. So, you know, all this stuff. I also see that it's radical, because at the moment our societies aren't conditioned to accept a state where people who could be productive will take free income from the state and not do anything. We're just not ready for that. And that's going to be my next slide. But what the job guarantee can do, because it's operating in the standard paid work paradigm, what it can do is start pushing the boundaries on what we consider to be productive work. And so I've advocated that musicians should be offered job guarantee. The greatest in Australia, the best income support for musicians is the dole, the unemployment benefit. And as a musician, I know that's worldwide. I know that. So I'd offer all my mates in bands who haven't got work other than playing a job. Now, what would they have to do in return other than go and play gigs? Well, they'd have to go to school. They'd have to go to schools and teach and do rehearsals in school halls and teach kids about how guitars work and how to compose music and how to get on with each other in bands and stuff. That's the big one. And, you know, I'd go surfing. I'd hire the surfers in the job guarantee. Now, what would they do other than surf? Well, one of the big problems in Australia is in summer people drown in the beaches because they don't understand water safety. So there's a huge role, because I jump in the most dangerous parts of the beach, because the rips take you out to the break. So they're ways, they're just examples that, you know, that I associate with. But I just walked up from somewhere here, and I've just saw thousands of jobs that are currently not being offered in Birmingham that could be offered, that would add to public value, and you could have many examples. But it's pushing the boundaries, that's the point. Okay, basic income, why not? The progressives have become obsessed with basic income. And I think I heard John McDonald the other day talking about basic income, for God's sake. And I've got a general rule: when the CEOs of companies who have some of the most pernicious labour relations, like Amazon, start advocating for something, I get suspicious. And why I'm opposed to basic income is because it surrenders to the neoliberal myth that the government can't do anything about unemployment. It gets the understanding of what causes unemployment completely wrong. And it's morphed over the history of the literature. It's lately about robots. But it gets the, you know, what Warren told you at the outset, why unemployment occurs. Because the deficit's too low. That's it. And I'm against the UBI because it's an individualistic approach. It's a neoliberal approach. We used to be involved in collectives. We related to each other in collective terms. Now we're relating to individuals in individualistic terms, as looking after themselves, and we're constructing these individuals who haven't got enough money as mere consumption units. Oh, they haven't got enough income, well, we better give them some so they can maintain a minimum amount of consumption. The CEOs want that so that people can still keep buying stuff. But that's not how we should construct individuals. Because if we offer an individual paid work, we're not only offering them an income, we're offering them inclusion in the mainstream society. We're offering them a chance to join social networks and meet their future partners and feel good about themselves as part of the values of society. That's why I hate UBI. And the other thing is that if you want to make the UBI sufficient to provide a good material standard of living, well then you create inflation. There's no anchor. Whereas if you want to avoid the inflationary pressures from it, you've got to make it so pitifully low that it doesn't accomplish any poverty alleviation anyway. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about in this room is EU. Thank you. And we've been in Edinburgh and Glasgow the last 2 nights. Whatever. And you've got to appreciate it's in the middle of the night for me. And, you know, the Scots are in a real bind because they now want their own currency, but they don't want to leave the EU. And you know the referendum results. You know the Remain was very strong in Scotland. But what they don't get is that the RUK, as we call it now up there, RUK, I love it, with a small r. The RUK is not going to, is already declared, as you all probably know, that the continuing nation is going to be the RUK. If Scotland becomes independent, then the legal entity that's currently called the UK is going to persist without Scotland. Now, why does that matter? Well, that's because the UK doesn't want to surrender its position on the Security Council of the UN. Because if it agreed that there were 2 new nations, that's what would have to happen. Now, why does that matter for Scotland? I'll come back to Brexit in a sec. Why does that matter for Scotland? It means it's because it's now a new nation. And under EU rules, if it then seeks accession to the EU, it has to adopt the euro. So that's this pickle Scotland are in. Now, we've moved the debate in Scotland from Sterlinisation. They've now basically got over that nightmare. But now they've got to embrace the EU thing. But you've got to embrace it before that. And here's a perfect example of how we differentiate between MMT as a body of work and then put values on top of it. Because, in effect, MMT as a core body of principles is agnostic about membership of the EU. So on Twitter I see MMTers say, well, MMT says we've got to be out of the EU. Who says? Bill Mitchell says. Well, that's conflating my values with my understanding of the way the monetary system works. And as a progressive individual, I hope, on the left, the true left, not the left that shifted out Blairite to the right, where the centre seems to have gone that way. That's right, yeah. The EU is the last thing, the last configuration that a progressive left person would advocate joining or being part of or staying in. And the reason I say that is because it's the neoliberalism isn't just a political preference, it's been embedded into the core legal structure of the arrangement in the treaties, starting with the Single European Act and then going through to Maastricht and on. The neoliberalism is core to the EU. It's a neoliberal project. And I understand these left people have sort of, you know, the EU for them is some sort of security blanket, some sort of expression of cosmopolitanism, you know, that grand tradition. Yet it's a really weird form of cosmopolitanism, because cosmopolitanism in the literature is, and the philosophical ideal is that everybody's in it. Well, the EU lets people die on beaches who try to get into the little cosy arrangement. So, it's not an expression of cosmopolitanism at all. It's a perverted form of cosmopolitanism. And how can you assert your democratic independence when you're forced to accept laws that are created by technocrats in Brussels, that are adjudicated in disputes by not your highest court, but the European Court of Justice, and which force trade agreements on you, which allows corporations under investment dispute mechanisms to then, if they feel as though their profits are being threatened by legislation by any particular jurisdiction in the interests of the people of that jurisdiction, they can take you to court and win and overrule that legislation. Why would you want to be part of that? That's the end.
Thank you, Bill. And now for our final speaker, last but certainly not least, the same warm welcome to Professor Martin Watts, who, as mentioned earlier, was the joint author of the recently published Macroeconomics textbook. Martin is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Newcastle University, New South Wales, and Research Associate of the Centre of Full Employment and Equity. He has published over 60 peer-reviewed articles in a broad range of leading international and domestic academic journals and co-authored 16 book chapters. Martin has gained extensive teaching experience over his career, primarily in labour economics and macroeconomics. Welcome, Martin.
Right, well, thank you very much. Some of what I am about to say, Bill has covered it to some degree, so I'm actually aware of the time, so I'm not going to talk too long, I hope. Okay, so I was given some fairly rough and ready guidelines as to what I should talk about, and I came up with this title for the talk a few days ago, and as I say, there's a bit of duplication with Bill. So first of all, by way of background, as Bill has said, mainstream neoclassical thinking is still dominant, but the development of MMT concepts started in the 90s with Randy, Bill and Warren, and the role of the post-Keynesian thought email discussion list. And I guess you can point to two fairly significant events in 1998. One was Randy's book, Understanding Modern Money, and also the beginning of coffee. And Warren was very supportive of that development at the University of Newcastle. And really, in the years that have followed, you've really got two centres of MMT. The first being UMKC, where Randy was, but has retired, but he's still involved, and a series of academics, some of who are on the advisory board, and they have got a critical mass, and they've produced graduate students who've gone on to teach MMT in a range of American universities. And then on a somewhat smaller scale at the University of Newcastle, Bill, of course, James Juniper, a colleague, and myself have been teaching MMT principles and using those principles in our research and graduate supervision. Engagement with orthodox economists at conferences and seminars in Australia became largely unproductive. MMT ideas were treated with some indifference, if not contempt. I guess most of the time people were fairly polite. Dialogue ceased in the early 2000s, I think it was 2002, Bill, when you asked the research director of the Reserve Bank as to whether a Reserve Bank cheque had ever bounced, and there was a pregnant pause, and somebody mentioned that...
Embarrassed silence.
That would be a better way of putting it. And then somebody started talking about inflation, in other words, the inference that the government was going to spend lots and cause inflation. There was also an uneasy relationship with post-Keynesian economists who, despite a lot of shared views, particularly about at least some aspects of the monetary system, had concerns about the exchange rate if you introduced a full employment policy, and equally the inflation ramifications. And they have a particular hostility to the job guarantee, which seems to persist. So despite their rhetoric, it's not clear that they really believe that full employment is sustainable. And I guess pre-GFC, there was some concern that an ageing and diminishing group of MMT aficionados would spend their time talking to each other, and the MMT message would really not get out. And of course, what did change the dialogue somewhat was, of course, the GFC and the realization that deregulated markets, particularly financial markets, didn't work for the betterment of all. And also post-GFC, of course, the total reliance on monetary policy, albeit there was some token fiscal stimulus measures about 10 years ago, that's created a lot of debate, and post-Keynesians have been part of that debate in terms of saying that austerity is not the way to go. In terms of the mainstream, of course, they have made few concessions. Their new monetary consensus does acknowledge that there is a role for fiscal policy under very specific circumstances. What is quite interesting is that mainstream introductory and intermediate texts have tried to maintain a monetarist foundation, that central banks are about controlling the money supply. But at the same time, they want to incorporate the insights about the modern monetary system and how the central bank actually doesn't target the money stock, it actually sets the interest rate. And myself and some colleagues did a very detailed review of 4 leading macro textbooks, and one has to conclude that they are totally incoherent. And quite how first-year teachers can actually make sense of these textbooks is hard to know. Of course, mainstream economists started talking about MMT. Krugman famously in the New York Times op-ed piece in 2011, subsequent articles through to this year. MMT ideas represented by Bill's blog. He mentioned that he started a blog. Randy didn't actually know what a blog was, I don't think.
No. What the F is a blog?
And that blog, and to a lesser extent New Economic Perspectives, has been very influential, and no doubt many of you present have read Bill's blog. Bill made brief reference to the sort of sequence of what happens when new ideas are introduced, largely ignored, and that was the case prior to the GFC, acknowledged but ridiculed. And here we have a couple of academics, Pally in the US, Ren Lewis in this country, who essentially say what's old is correct and what's new is wrong. In other words, MMT doesn't really add anything. And of course, the somewhat hysterical discussion that's now going on, particularly in America. But Recently, there has been some quite sympathetic material, articles in relatively serious newspapers, even the Australian, strangely enough, which is a Murdoch publication. And of course, the defining moment really was AOC starting to talk about MMT, which led to the condemnation which Bill made reference to at the beginning of his talk. And of course the Senate motion, which essentially was supported by Lawrence Summers, surprise, surprise, Janet Yellen, and a whole series of members of right-wing think tanks. But equally support for MMT from a range of individuals, including this financial character. Do you know him, Warren? Montier? Yeah. Which is his blog is very good. He's very supportive of MMT, and he captures MMT in a very few words, and it's a fairly catchy title too. Okay, so that's by way of background. So I'm going to briefly talk about the dominance of mainstream economics. I mean, Bill also has already made some reference to that, raising the profile of MMT, etc., etc. So in an ideal world, in a university system that works in a discipline that is not dysfunctional like economics, you would think that the frank and fearless exchange of ideas would lead to some sort of progress in the paradigm. But there are serious vested interests at work in terms of tenure, promotion, general progression in the academic scene, and the prospect of other lucrative opportunities resulting from some profile. I also reflect on the issue of paradigm change, contradictions emerging in the paradigm, and how that leads potentially, at least according to Kuhn, to a crisis in the prevailing paradigm and the resolution of anomaly via a new paradigm. One may pose the question, well, if you believe Kuhn, you would think that economic thought is actually progressing, and so us mere mortals here are standing on the shoulders of giants of the past, and everything is moving forward. Well, unfortunately, it ain't as simple as that. And certainly, when you look at the responses to the GFC, policymakers had learnt nothing from the lessons of the Great Depression. One can talk about debates about philosophy of science. Milton Friedman just thought that theories should be tested on the basis of their predictions. He didn't realise that different theories could lead to the same predictions, which is observational equivalence. And more fundamentally, there has been this separation, this divorce, if you like, in terms of academic debate. The mainstream stay over here and we stay over here, because it's quite pointless in trying to engage with them. So, raising the public profile of MMT, well, obviously it's starting to happen. It seems to me it's quite interesting to think about the dynamics of the introduction of new ideas into the political domain. Do interest groups and public opinion drive the agenda and the politicians follow, or is it the reverse? And an example to me, and I could be accused of being wrong here, is that we had the same-sex marriage debate in Australia, where clearly activism, grassroots activism prevailed. And obviously politicians then get on board, but the activists drive the agenda. And it seems to me, in terms of MMT, the role of politicians is that much more important, because the ideas are intangible and counterintuitive, and unless you have politicians talking about them, then to really get some traction is very difficult. And the problem, of course, with most politicians is that they're careerists and they lack vision, and they're really unwilling to bite the bullet and articulate counterintuitive ideas. So the government is not financially constrained when they believe there's a very high cost of doing that. And this sort of political cowardice we've certainly observed in Australia, and you've had dealings with the Greens, haven't you, Bill, with no positive impact in terms of their view about macro policy. So AOC, Alexandria Ortiz-Cortez, has played a very important role in the US. Political recognition of MMT, at least in the US, is a start. And one would assume that other politicians would now start engaging with the debates. And clearly there is a role for activism, not only engaging with politicians, but getting, if you like, the critical mass of the population to start embracing MMT ideas. And I won't presume to provide advice as to how that should be done as such. What is important is the nature of the MMT message which is disseminated. And we came across this sort of issue at the last MMT conference in New York. As I say, some of the mainstream media at least are giving MMT a run. At present, my perception is the UK debate, like in the US, is very superficial between academic economists. There's Pally in the US, who's frankly dreadful, very superficial. And what tends to happen is they don't really address the body of MMT work. They select a few papers or books or whatever, and they don't reflect on the fact that people are writing about MMT even in 2019. The UK criticism seems to be, well, it's obviously of our blogs to some degree. Portes, mainly Macro, which is Simon Wren-Lewis's blog. And there's been, as I understand it, significant Twitter activity, but I don't subscribe to Twitter because my life is too short. And also, if we're going to have a serious academic debate, a serious discussion, then Twitter is really totally inappropriate. And what I find interesting in respect of Simon Wren-Lewis is that he has not written a mainly macro blog about MMT this year. So it's more subterranean in terms of using Twitter. Macro is difficult, there's no doubt. Like most disciplines, it is driven by concepts and principles. The fallacy of composition is very challenging. Theoretical models are very important. But developing a theoretical model, specifically in algebraic terms, does not give it credibility per se, because it is the nature of the assumptions, something that Friedman wished to ignore. So the really important thing in terms of the dissemination of MMT is to reflect on the fact that it is the current state of understanding is the result of many years of thought and interaction amongst MMT economists, and that for anybody who is pushing out the message, it's very important to understand the principles and not start uttering glib two-liners about government can provide for your every need. So, in very general terms, MMT incorporates chartalism and functional finance, but it's grounded in institutional practice. In other words, what central banks actually do as well as what banks actually do, and how fiscal policy is constructed. So Warren has touched on this. This is a rather more sort of formal way of talking about the fiat currency. It's issued by the state, it's a unit of account, it's got value because the state imposes taxes in that currency. And fiat money is money that the state has declared to be legal tender. Now, that doesn't require legal tender laws, because if people are paying their taxes in the currency, then other transactions between households and firms and so on will also take place using that currency. Then we have functional finance, which goes back to Lerner and the notion that fiscal policy should be used to counteract economic fluctuations, to secure full employment and price stability, and you can completely ignore the impact on deficits and accumulated debt. Institutional practice, as I say, refers to how these key institutions work, how they operate. And given that institutional practice is precisely what central banks and others say they do, it is really not theory at all. And you can go to the Bank of England website, you can go to the RBA website in Australia, and they'll tell you what they actually do, how they make sure that the rate they announce every month is the rate that banks lend to each other, how they engage in open market operations and so on. The idea of institutional practice, though, is somewhat nuanced, because there is a distinction between what MMT says about the capacity of the monetary system to operate, and indeed policy, and the fact that that countries impose voluntary constraints on the operation of certain aspects of policy. So, for example, major purchases of government debt on the primary market, in other words, when that debt is issued, the Bank of England doesn't go and buy a whole load of that debt. That is either outlawed or simply in practice doesn't occur in many countries. Not all countries, because Canada's a bit different. So it's very important to distinguish between talking in fairly abstract terms about MMT and the capacity of these institutions and how to operate in a particular way, and the way that these institutions in a particular country operate. And countries are different. And in writing the textbook, that has been a challenge, that institutional arrangements do differ across countries. So it's very important that MMTers are very clear about what they're talking about. Not are they talking in abstract terms, or are they talking about the operation of the US economy or the UK economy or whatever. And well, let me move on to the next. No, I'll go back. So if we're talking in fairly abstract terms, then it's important to realise that that currency sovereignty is highly important in terms of the capacity of the way the conduct of policy can be conducted. Now, currency sovereignty is very important because it refers to an economy with its own currency, so not a Eurozone country, operating with a freely floating exchange rate, and also, and this really doesn't apply to modern developed economies, not overexposed to debt denominated in a foreign currency. There's no reason for a country with its own, well, a modern developed economy with its own currency, there's no reason for it to to sell foreign currency denominated debt. And if you have a country which satisfies those conditions, including the one about debt exposure, and Australia fits the bill very well, and the UK would as well, then of course monetary and fiscal policies can be focused purely on the domestic economy. So the external economy, and therefore trade and exchange rates, will be handled by the fact there is a flexible exchange rate. So in terms of engagement of MMT ideas with those who don't agree, these basic principles are of central importance. They really are the key building blocks. And in terms of when I read articles that are often critical of MMT, and I'm wary of the time, so I'll be quick, if the article doesn't talk about these principles, then as far as I'm concerned it's totally deficient. If you're talking about the operation of the macroeconomy in a particular country, you've got to understand what the institutional arrangements are. Okay, and a warning about, as I say, glib statements. You know, government can spend and buy anything that it wants, and you just set up your wish list, you know, get rid of student loans, more money in the national health, blah, blah, blah. There is a real resource limit on obviously what can be spent. Okay, the textbook. Well, I'll be very brief about this. Of course, the textbook joined a very illustrious stable of textbooks, including Mankey and Krugman. Guilt by association, I suppose, but hopefully not. It does represent the consolidation of the work that's been done over 20 years. It is pretty rigorous in terms of how it's developed. And let me just, I'm going to jump a few because I'm wary of the time. I'll just go to the content. The conceptual basis and theoretical basis of MMT is very carefully outlined. There's rigorous stock flow consistent modelling, and is adopted and illustrated by the use of balance sheets. There is a breadth and depth of analysis of competing perspectives. So it's not as if, although it's an MMT book, we ignore the alternative views, but we don't pretend to be pluralist because we understand how modern monetary systems work. Lots of reference to empirical evidence, including 3 major currency crises. History of thought gets a lot of attention, and contemporary policy issues in the last few chapters, which are obviously highly relevant. Teaching MMT, I won't go through all this other than to say that you need good students and committed students, and there weren't that many when I was teaching it at Newcastle. The good ones that one comes across, they become very excited with the ideas, and some of them obviously go on to postgraduate work, which is very rewarding. But the majority probably want to do marketing or some other major in their degree, and economics is simply too hard for them. Okay, final comments. We are making some progress in terms of getting traction. It is important that the ideas are represented appropriately in public discussion and discussion with friends in the pub and so on. I hope that the textbook is useful in assisting the transmission of the MMT framework to both students and interested public. You have to deal with initial disbelief. I don't know what percentage of you is still in the state of initial disbelief. It may be very few. So, well, you can assist in this process of the emergence and consolidation of MMT in the public sphere by reading the book and also recommending the book. and this is not supposed to be a sales plug for the book, it's supposed to be getting the ideas of MMT out. So thank you very much. One here. Yeah, so 2 here and 1 here to start with.
Hello. Oh, hi. Hi. My name is John Meyer. I'd like to address this to either Bill or Warren. In World War II, the US government funded the war effort, presumably from a currency creation perspective, from an MMT perspective, and then raised war bonds under the guise of funding the war. But I have read, and I don't know if this is the case, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are, as to whether that was an anti-inflationary measure to issue war bonds when it isn't a requirement.
Do you want to answer the question straight away? Do you want a bit of time to think and we get the next question?
Yeah, start with Jim.
They've got such big brains, I don't think they need to raise There we are.
The war bonds were issued really as a solidarity measure. There were all these posters, about Uncle Sam and stuff, and they wanted people to feel as though they were part of the war effort. That's what the historians tell us. The main price initiatives were rationing. That's how that was, the rations were the fear of inflation rather than the war bonds.
Just a quick interesting story to that. One of our associates is Jamie Galbraith, and his father was John Kenneth Galbraith, and he was in charge of that. And so I talked to him about it a little bit. I'm not a student of it, and pretty much like, as Bill said, but because it was interesting, because I come along and I said, look, the price level is a function of prices paid by government. They're the monopoly supplier. And he talked about, his dad had said about that during World War II, and they recognized prices paid by government was critical, in this thing. But when they came to the 70s, all the Keynesians at the time went in and with price and wage controls in the economy. And I think that's what discredited the Keynesian movement from everything else, because no matter how bad things got, people didn't want the government telling them how much they could charge at a grocery store or something like that. And the irony is that these, I said, didn't they know that it was the government's prices being set and not private sector? They didn't need to do that. He said, this was before his father died. He said, a few years ago we went back and we were going to write something about that, but I guess they never got around to it. But it's kind of an interesting irony that they certainly should have known that, and it certainly should have given them different proposals for the 70s, but it didn't get carried over. Yeah.
I feel I have to add to that.
Yeah.
Not to do with the US experience, but of course war bonds were issued the beginning of World War II in this country, and it was very much seen in terms of solidarity and all that. And the war bonds were highly undersubscribed, and the sort of propaganda issues of the Germans crowing that the Brits couldn't even raise some money from their own population was such that they actually, the Bank of England fudged it and said that indeed, yes, the allocation had been sold, and it hadn't been. And Keynes got to know about this and said, masterful.
At the beginning of the Iraq War, the U.S. had a proposal out to have war bonds. And I think somebody from the Treasury told the politicians, like, we got it covered. We don't need to do that.
Okay. Next.
Okay. Right. Any of you can answer this if you want to, or you can do what you did then. I'm Ian Charles, and I ask this question to ordinary people because from time to time our Royal Mint issues another set of coins, and at the moment we have a £1 coin, lovely little thing with 12 sides, and it reminds me of something that we had when there were
240 pennies to the pound. They were great big things with pennies, 4 centimetres across, but we had a threepenny bit or a 3p coin, and there were 80 of them to the pound. Now, the spending power to a little boy was that threepenny bit would get me from my house in Leeds to the centre of Leeds. It would also, if I chose, if I had another one, I would spend it on a comic book, something like Beano or Dandy or something like that I could read on the bus or at any other time. And the other thing that it would do, small boys economics, was that it would buy me an ice lolly, a fruity ice lolly, with
need to sort of move it ahead.
okay, and with an ice cream middle. Now, the spending power of the new pound coin doesn't do that. You would need £2 now in order to purchase what a threepenny bit, 80 to the pound, would be. And I've asked people this, and they've said, it's inflation. Well, I know it's inflation. But I want to know, and grind down the currency, or whatever. I want to know who would do such a thing, or where the other 159 threepenny bits have gone, and perhaps why couldn't we just spend as much as we need on the NHS or write off the student debt? Why couldn't we do that? What would happen if we did? So it's all tied up with why inflation, who would cut a currency into lots of little bits, where it's gone, who's got it, and why can't we do a bit of it? Okay, thanks.
If you had been an adult then, instead of buying your lollies.
If what?
If you had been an adult at that point, instead of buying your lollies, your income would have been significantly lower than it is now. So you're only focusing on one aspect of the relative price rather than all the other. Your capacity is much greater now. So sure, you can call that inflation if you want, but it's a pretty meaningless way of thinking about it.
So look, what matters isn't what £1 buys, it's what all the pounds buy. So what did all the pounds buy last year? What was your real GDP that was somehow distributed, I assume, fairly equally in the UK, right? Not like the US. So, okay, so but how is that whole, how is your pile of stuff? Is your pile of real stuff larger or smaller? What did all the pounds buy, no matter what the number is? And that's gone up by 1%, 2%, 3% a year, depending on your productivity and growth rate and everything else. And that's the important thing for your real standard of living. And of course, the distributional issues are serious, but it's a different issue.
Moving rapidly on.
Yeah, my name is Christopher Brewster. My question is, assuming that modern monetary theory is an accurate analysis of the current economic system and the way capitalism works, I'd like a few thoughts from the panel about things like the Green New Deal, particularly in view of the fact that growth of any sort seems to have deleterious effects on the environment. And a lot of recent research, I refer you to Jason Hickel's recent paper, shows that it's very, very difficult to decouple economic growth from impacts on the environment. So I'd like just to expand on those thoughts. How can modern monetary theory work towards perhaps an alternative economic system that goes beyond the current system as we have it in view of our economic impact?
I mean, one of the... I've had a long history of, let's be kind, just discussions with the Greens. And I'm being polite, but I'm trying to work out how to be polite.
Don't bother.
Yeah. And the point is that these discussions are typically between cosmopolitans and others, where the things that they're talking about are affecting rural communities, say in terms of forestry. So they say, from Sydney, they say we've got to ban all forestry. Yet they never consider in Warhope, which is a rural area in New South Wales, which relies on forestry for jobs and their material standard of living, what's going to be the effect on them. And so one of the tensions, I think, in all of this Green New Deal stuff is that tension that how do you ensure that you don't kill off the material prosperity of communities that are relying on pollutive activity? That's the first point. Second point is they say, we've got to have zero growth. And then I say, well, are you going to give up your mobile phone? Are you going to stop driving your car? And of course, the problem is if you're having, and moreover, are you going to start compulsory sterilisation of people? And the point is that if you have population growth, you have to have economic growth to maintain material standards of living. Now then you have a big distributional argument, because I'm happy to give up some of my material, not my phone, but that's not going to be enough. And so the Green New Deal, the way I conceive of it, is that first of all it's got to have a recognition of all of us that there's got to be just transitions. That means that we have to make sure that those people in the communities that are going to lose don't lose too much in material terms. We can't really address the sort of spiritual. When I was doing my PhD in Manchester, it was at the height of the mining strike. Shows how old I am. And, those mining communities, it was more than an income to them, it was their identity. So we can't really fix that up. So that's the first point. The second point is that we have to understand that the market will not deliver satisfactory outcomes. And that leads to the next point, is that we've got to ensure that the Green New Deal doesn't become financialised. And what I mean by that is vehicles for whole new sets of products and derivative products that basically the Wall Street and their city here benefit from. And what that then leads you to think is that, and this is a real disagreement I have with the Greens, is that they're advocating carbon trading systems. That's a market system. That's a financialisation of the environmental problem. And I get death threats at home in the mail because I advocate closing. I live in a coal district. Newcastle is the largest coal export port in the world. And I advocate no market system, just the government announce in 20 years' time, no more coal exports. Because once you embrace trading systems, you financialise the problem, and you'll get these obscene situations where the big polluters go into small communities in less developed countries like northern India and that ruin the community so that they can claim carbon credits that they can then continue polluting in their other country. So they're the things that I think about. And the other thing is that the Green New Deal, total support for it, but it's a major transformation of society, and there's huge vested interests that are at stake, and you've just got to be patient. It's going to take time.
I had two things I wanted to reinforce, see if I can remember both of them. So, first of all, comes back to unemployment. I think the major cause of environmental degradation is unemployment, people looking for money. Okay, so if you had full employment, people had good jobs, they wouldn't want the trees cut down, they wouldn't want anything dumped in the rivers, but when it comes to needing the money, they have a different opinion. So number one, so many things start with real solid full employment policy where there's jobs, opportunity, and everything else. So I think that's part of the problem, and I don't think the Greens have gone and recognized that. It's fundamental. The other thing is rationing by price, such as the carbon schemes, are regressive. When you're rationing by price, it's regressive. And some things you want to do that. There should be rewards for having excelled and done better, fine, but not something like that. Okay, that doesn't fit at all. So too many of these market, in fact, all of them, but I'll say too many, it's all regressive ways to do it, where the people who can least afford it are the ones that pay the most in real terms. And so I just wanted to add those two things to amplify what Bill was saying.
Okay, more questions?
Hello. I'm Martin Frieden here. There's a question on inflation, but just prior to that, I just want to comment on two things that Warren and Bill just said. Bill, you mentioned something about the Green New Deal and the problem with population, and Warren, you mentioned, well, if you get full employment. And actually, there's an amazing video on TED by the late Hans Rosling showing very elegantly, there may be other arguments, how to deal with the population explosion problem, which is making the poorest more wealthy quicker than their birth rate goes down dramatically. And there's a very elegant way, if you look at Hans Rosling on TED on that. Back to inflation, I'm sort of vaguely socially active. One of the things I'm on is on Quora. So me and this guy, John Besterfield, who I doubt is here, I think he lives in the States, we're active on that. So there's also the usual questions about that. I've got your excellent textbook. There's not enough there for me to answer some of the inflation questions, so I'm reading your papers and so on. So on inflation in general, there was a question about the Weimar Republic, which basically I gave an answer. Well, look what Keynes did with the economic consequences of peace. If we'd had MMT then, we'd have probably done a very similar analysis showing the dangers of those policies leading to inflation and potentially hyperinflation. But it also makes me think about, for example, looking at Venezuela, this large foreign currency debt and all sorts of other factors to do with the oligarchy in the US. I'm looking for decent analysis, because looking at it now, it should be obvious you could have made an argument, an MMT analysis of Venezuela a few years ago, but it's very easy to do these things with hindsight. We look around at all these Austrians who keep making these complaints about inflation, and they can keep them being wrong, which is great. We show them why they're wrong, and they're wrong. But on the other side, there are scenarios where inflation occurs. Is anyone doing the analysis to make policy recommendations? Don't do this because there'll be inflation. For example, with Venezuela, with its foreign currency debt and a supply side crash when the oil price dropped.
I mean, Venezuela is the latest one, but for 20 years or so, Zimbabwe's been the poster child for hyperinflation. And if I ask this audience, what do you know about what happened in Zimbabwe? How many people have a detailed knowledge of what happened? Some people, not many. It had nothing to do with deficits, particularly fiscal deficits. What happened in Zimbabwe, and it's a similar story to the Weimar Republic, what happened in Zimbabwe was Robert Mugabe decided he wanted to reward his freedom fighters who took them out of the colonial yoke of Britain. And the way he did it, so the sentiment, I think, as a left progressive, I think it was a great idea. But the way he did it was ridiculous, because Zimbabwe had the most efficient agricultural sector in Africa. It was the food bowl of Africa. And so what he did, he said, okay, I'll reward, and he was also addressing another issue. The colonial land tenure outcomes were incredibly unequal, white versus black. The whites had the land, the blacks didn't. So he wanted to redress that, and so he gave the farm. You know the story. They took the farms over. These were good machine gunners, hopeless farmers, and within a very short time, 60% of agricultural output collapsed, and that led to a whole lot of other things happening, with using what foreign exchange they had to fund food imports rather than to provide money for manufacturers to import capital and all this sort of stuff. But under those circumstances, any spending, whether it's private or public, would be inflationary. It told you nothing about the conduct of fiscal policy. And I'm not saying the conduct of fiscal policy was good. I'm just saying that you can't use the hyperinflation to give you any information about the conduct of fiscal policy. It doesn't tell you anything about what would happen if the British government funded a job guarantee scheme. Nothing at all. If you have a society where the supply side crashes, you're going to probably get hyperinflation.
So, we're all the talk on inflation comes down to what happens if you have overspending, too much demand. And yes, you can cause inflation doing that. I'm sure Bill and I, if you put us in charge, said I want 100% inflation, we wouldn't be like the European Central Bank. We could get that done quick. But
Japan, then?
yeah, I could do it in Japan in 20 minutes, like all the inflation they want on the fiscal side. Eliminate the consumption tax, don't add to it. I can show you how to get some spending going. But of course, the deficit would go up, right? So we know how to do this. They don't, right? They're going the other way. But the thing is, I've been around since 1973, 45 years. I have never seen inflation caused by excess demand. I've just never seen it. I know it's there. So all the inflations are caused by something else. So let's go to Turkey today with 25% inflation. The unemployment headline is 10%. Their debt to GDP is only 35%. They've got 25% a year inflation. I don't know, it's not coming from excess demand. One place it's coming from is their overnight rates, their policy rates, 24%. And I've been making the case that the interest rate, for all practical purposes, will be the inflation rate. But we're just a quick answer here. So there are other things. Now, Venezuela, the other place that inflation comes from is Google Venezuela corruption. And you'll see Mr. So-and-so was arrested in Miami after having somehow borrowed $2.4 billion from the banking system, sold the currency, got U.S. dollars, and was money laundering in Miami. All right, that's just one guy, $2.4 billion. When you're borrowing money through the banking system, I won't say illegally, but like that, insiders getting loans that they're not going to pay, there is no such thing, they're not real assets. And then you sell the currency immediately. They don't care what the exchange rate is because they're going to get their dollars and abscond with it, right? And you do that over and over again, your currency collapses. And it doesn't matter if it's just dropped 50%. They'll do it again. If it's dropped 25%, they'll do it again. And what happens is, I was just reading about Venezuela today. They're still using bolivars. They might need 1 million of them, to your point, instead of 1. But they're still, well, I need it to buy food. I need it to do this. They're still there. And so you've got the banking system, which can be an open channel of corruption, and state-owned enterprises do the same thing. If you've got corruption in the state-owned enterprises where they're getting funded by the government, allowed to borrow public credit, and then insiders are selling foreign exchange, the exchange rate goes down, you will see inflation coming in through the foreign exchange window. So I could go on on this, but I will let it go.
Just to finish, we discuss it later,
Yeah.
was why are we not making this analysis before these events occur? Rather than hindsight, it's very easy to make this analysis. That's what I'm looking for.
Well, I think, the analysis that corruption has been a problem in Latin America, in places like Turkey and state-owned enterprises all over the world, they get politicized. The problem with, private ownership has serious problems. There's no question about it. We see it all the time. But the politicization of public, it's just as well publicized. It's all dangerous stuff. It's got to be regulated, supervised, somehow monitored. It all goes back.
And if I had been writing my blog when Robert Mugabe announced he was going to take all the farms over, you would have had a bit of a blog about it.
Yeah. And then he wouldn't have done it that way.
That would have stopped it.
Gentleman at the back.
Hi, thanks. Yeah. My name's Tony. I'm totally with virtually everything that's said today. The one sort of slight issue I have is the exports equals bad, imports equals good element of MMT, because the way I see it, for most economies such as the UK, we bring in imports, definitely very good. We give them our pounds in return, but obviously in the long run, that means that the people who hold the pounds have a call on UK assets or UK goods and services. So the way I see it, ultimately, it would net to zero. The one exception to that, where I do agree with you, is America. As with the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, then the people who get dollars are happy to use the dollars for buying oil, buying gold, buying copper. They don't have to spend it in America. So I totally agree with you in terms of the dollar, but I don't agree with the export is bad, imports good for everything other than the dollar. Can you talk about that?
Well, So what's happening is you're taking in real goods and services, and somebody else is piling up a sterling account at your bank, right? So, and it's not a governmental deficit. The government hasn't done anything. It's just somebody in the private sector is doing this. And whoever's holding those accounts is taking a pretty enormous risk because the value is undefined. We just saw what's happened to each one. Okay, and if at some point it suits public purpose to not allow your exports, you can do that. You can put export controls on, you can have export taxes, you can do all kinds of things to make sure that guy who, you know, from Korea who sold you all those Hyundais can't buy anything with that money he got. And you know what? They don't care. Because the reason they're doing it is because the exporters are in charge in those countries. And they're doing it to keep their wages low, to suppress their real costs, right? So that they can sell to you so that he can make his profit margin, whatever it is. And he doesn't really care about what's happening to the standard of living of his country, population, or whether in 10 or 20 years they can ever buy anything with the dollars the government has piled up as foreign exchange reserves to support his immediate sales. So you're on the right side of the trade, let's put it that way. You've got you hold all the cards at that point. They have a number in a bank account, and you have control of all your product that you can export or not on any terms you want. You haven't guaranteed prices in the future. If you guarantee prices in the future, that falls under external debt. That's a whole different thing. Yeah.
Australia's been running external deficits of about 4% of GDP since the 70s. And that means that the rest of the world are accumulating these financial assets in Australian dollars, and we're getting iPhones. Now, who's got the real risk? I don't have the real risk. I've got the iPhone, and the car, and the BMWs, and all the rest of it. I don't have a BMW. Motorcycle. And so imagine these people that are holding all these Australian dollars, and I'm using Australian dollars specifically to avoid this US stuff. Now, what are they going to do with it? Well, if they try to sell it, you know, a lot of progressives say, well, they'll just dump the Australian dollar. Well, they'd be stupid to do that because they'll make immediate losses. So the first thing is that they're going to be risk averse in liquidating the stocks of Australian dollars they hold. Okay, so then what can they do with them? Okay, they can transfer them into real goods and services available for sale in Australian dollars. Well, that's why Australia's got a Foreign Investment Review Board, to stop them having unregulated capacity to buy whatever they can that's for sale. So we don't allow foreigners to buy real estate unless they produce new real estate, houses. Now, the foreign investment guidelines, in my view, are far too lax, because we're seeing in our cities apartment block booms because they can actually build new constructions. And there's one famous case in Melbourne where I grew up, where they've done studies of the water usage, and these towers are 80% unoccupied. They're just speculative vehicles. So that's the first point. The risk is on the exporter, not the importer. But the second point, and I agree with you, this is an agreement, is that as a progressive left person, I don't want foreign capital being able to use that money, that is those Australian dollar holdings, in ways that give corporate sector leverage. And so I think, and I think this is a problem everywhere, that you've got to make sure that that money can't be used to manipulate the political process through lobbying. You've got to have very tight restrictions, like Warren said, on what they can buy and what they can't buy with it in Australian dollars. But it's not just this idea that because the US is the so-called reserve currency, that MMT only applies to the US is a falsehood. It applies to any monetary system.
Just really quick. out there you have the likes of the J.P. Morgan World Index, and they give every currency a weighting. It adds up to 100%. And if you're a prudent investor, you want your diversity of currency holdings to be fit that. So if you're in India, you just sold your construction company for rupiah or whatever, and you want to retire, you now go to your investment management person. He says, okay, well, you need to diversify across countries, and 4% is going to be in Australian dollars, and 22% will be U.S. dollars. And so when they do that, they've assured these countries in the index that they will be they can be net importers forever if they want to, because those funds go into retirement accounts, pension funds. They're all diversifying globally this way. All the people working check off the box, yes, I want global diversification, because over the last 28 years it's been 0.5% better than not doing it, or some study somebody did. And those funds never get spent. They just pile up forever. Yeah.
It's equally worth noting that occasionally fears are expressed about the Chinese dumping US-denominated assets, when it never happens for the same reason of capital loss.
Right. Actually, they did do it for almost $1 trillion a few years ago. Nobody even noticed.
Okay, moving on. Where is the...
My name's Christopher Hughes, and I'm like the Christopher front who's actually gone now. My question was George Monbiot's article in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago on capitalism. In the middle of the article, there was one 5-word paragraph which said, "Green growth is an illusion," and that was my question. And I don't want to provoke Bill into using Anglo-Saxon in public, but I suppose my subsequent question would be, I spoke in an exchange with Patricia Pino last week. She tweeted, "Then they ridicule you," and I asked, when do you think we'll enter the phase of we will win? And I just wondered what the panel thought of that.
In most of the advanced countries, the unmet need is going to be in terms of personal care services and environmental care services. And those types of occupations and jobs and services deliver massive social benefits, but they're hard to get profit from. And so if you transfer people out of coal mining into personal care services, GDP continue to grow. So we say there's still economic growth going on, but that's green growth, because very low carbon intensive in reading a person a book and massaging their feet and doing their garden and growing more trees for them, because then they can be maintained under a job guarantee. So I just don't buy this argument that you can't have green growth. We've got to have growth with more people. And until we come, and I think Martin's point's very important, that the more educated we become and the more secure in employment we become, we have less children, because we don't have to have our own social security scheme with more children. But that's an evolutionary thing. But we can have green growth, and what that implies, I didn't mention it under Green New Deal, is that society is going to have an engaged debate where it reflects that the proportion of growth that's taken by the public sector will have to be larger in the future. Now, that's not socialism I'm advocating, although I do advocate socialism. But that's a reality, that it's shifting to activities that provide net social benefits rather than provide net private benefits.
Question for Bill: How many research assistants do you think the average university professor would hire if he had the budget for it?
Infinite.
Labor shortage already.
The lady on the corner.
Hello there. Let's talk about UBI. I realised that you obviously didn't have a lot of time to go into a lot of detail, but I had a totally different idea about it. Give an example, you might have a couple where one partner's working so that the other one can perhaps either go to university or study or develop a new business or some sort of business idea, so that it's okay with a couple, so one can earn the money, but if this person on their own, they can't do that. So that was my idea for a UBI, and also things like I think you mentioned earlier, carers who have to look after disabled or sick people in their family, so they'd have some sort of proper income. And the only other question I had was, have you ever spoken to John McDonnell, or would you like to do so?
On the last, I had a meeting with him last October. Very unsatisfactory outcome. I publicly acknowledge his Labor Party is being poisoned by their advisors. On the UBI, there's the last example. You just described a job, caring job, not a government paying for doing nothing. You're talking about a job. In the first instance, you're talking about making opportunities available for people to be educated. That's a publicly funded education scheme, not UBI.
Okay, so let's go back to Pompeii for a moment. They put a tax on everybody's house, and then they said, you know what? We're going to give everybody UBI, so we'll give you enough money to pay the tax, so nobody has to worry about it. Okay, they've just defeated the whole purpose, right? Now nobody shows up for work to be the police officers or anything else because the need for the money's been taken away. So that's the risk. If they only give them part of what they need to pay the tax, then you're still going to get people showing up for work. The whole point is the state needs to provision itself. It needs people working for the state, whether it's soldiers or public health workers or whatever. And UBI, at a certain point, undermines the whole thing, and the form it takes is hyperinflation. The money doesn't buy anything anymore. So it's okay in small amounts, but if you get to a tipping point which isn't all that high, yeah, the whole civilization ceases to operate. So,
People who haven't got enough money to live on.
yeah, but if you get it, I'm just saying, if you get it wrong, is a huge penalty. It's not like there's a it's not a small penalty. If it's a job where people have to work to get the money, that's different. In Pompeii, when they showed up to work and they were paid to sell their time, then you're going to get people looking to work. But if you don't have to do anything, remember, it's only worth what you have to do to get it at the margin. And if you don't have to do anything to get it, it's worth nothing. And so I'm not totally against it, okay? I'm just saying you got to be very careful.
You do have to have a sensible social security system in terms of people who've, got disabilities or whatever. Yeah.
I mean, just one more point on that. The other thing is that if you only had a UBI and you want to discipline the inflation process, what do you have to do? You have to create unemployment. Whereas with a job guarantee, you create more employment by disciplining the inflation process. It's a very fundamental difference.
Thank
So
you.
maybe two more. How's the... Yeah, one, two.
Can you speak to applying MMT to developing nations, particularly reducing import dependence? And sorry, can you speak to applying MMT to developing nations? Sorry. Oh, okay. Can you speak to applying MMT to developing nations, please, particularly import dependence?
One of my slides was about that having your own currency doesn't make a nation materially rich, necessarily. It means that that nation that state can always bring whatever productive resources that are available into full productive use, but the level of output mightn't be sufficient. And other nations that I've worked in have problems with food dependency. and other nations have problems with energy dependencies. And this is a good example of how we're differentiating between core MMT principles and values. Because what I've advocated in the book that I wrote with Thomas Farsi before this one in 2017 was that a solidaristic world, at the moment we've got multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that were created, by the way, in a different era to do different things. So the IMF was created to provide funds to nations that were struggling to maintain the fixed exchange rate system, and the World Bank was created really to reconstruct Europe. And then when we floated exchange rates in the early 70s, those institutions really lost their meaning and sort of morphed into their neoliberal form. And so what I advocate as a progressive left person, not as an MMTer, is eliminating those institutions and creating a new multilateral capacity that would. It's quite clear that if a country can't export, but it has to import food, and nobody will buy its exports, and it can't grow its own food, then it's got a problem. And it's, to me, as a progressive left person, this is where I think about globalism, not the EU, but as a true global cosmopolitanism and solidarity, that we've got to create a new form of IMF that allows the advanced countries to distribute foreign currency to the poorer countries so they can eat. But that's not an MMT thing.
Get you next.
At the beginning of Professor Bill Mitchell's presentation, you mentioned robotics. And my question to the panel, not just to Professor Bill Mitchell, would be, is there a way to supplant the labour in the labour market, given Professor Michael Osborne at Oxford University's research that suggests that 70% of white-collar jobs will disappear by 50-50, is your view that there's a way to supplant that labour? And also I'd be interested to get your point of view on Bill Gates' public comments with regards to robots should be taxed as a way to actually renew the supply of taxation in the labour market with regards to the loss of labour in the labour market itself. I'd be interested to get your point of view on that.
Okay, so what that whole discussion does is it confuses.
This is obviously just assuming that you obviously have views with regards to the validity of the argument about robotics, and it could be also that you consider the whole argument just to be a total misnomer. I just should have put that on the end.
Okay, so what that argument does is, I'll say, confuses, conflates a productivity story with an unemployment story, which is an unspent income story. Unemployment's always an unspent income story. It's from somebody not spending their income and no other agent willing to spend more than his income, and so you get unemployment. It's a monetary phenomenon. Productivity is an entirely different thing. We've already had the robot story happen. Okay, not 200 years ago we couldn't have this because we all had to be out growing food. You needed 99% of the people in agriculture, or we weren't going to be able to eat. And today, less than 1% in the U.S. produces enough 8,000 calories a day a person or something and exports food. Manufacturing now is down to 7% of the people in the U.S. If you got it up to 8%, this room would be filled with junk and we couldn't have a meeting. Okay, and so we've already got productivity is already taken away. Over 99% of the agricultural jobs, which was everybody, and then when it was manufactured, they've already lost. And unemployment is still at kind of the same numbers it's always been. All right, and that's because it's got nothing to do with unemployment and productivity. Are two entirely different matters. And that's what we're trying to separate here. And so you want as much productivity as possible. Okay, that frees people up to do other things. There's always an there's always a lot more to do than there are people to do it. There are always more jobs than you could possibly do. The university professors can't possibly get all the research assistants they want. All right? It's not possible. And so we wake up every day with a labor shortage, but we wind up with a labor surplus because we don't understand the unspent income story.
Yes, that's the first point. And the most point. But you know, this other thing, the other point I think about is that it's as if this is sort of like a tsunami. Now, tsunamis we can't really control. They're beyond our policy control. But you know, it's sort of like saying if we just eliminated all the traffic lights, there'd be chaos. Of course there would be. And so if this was really a tsunami, then we'd have problems. But the government can always provide conditions through which private sector activity is mediated. And so if robotics really were the problem, then we'd just say you can't do it. That's it. But the real problem is that we have created a mindset that our currency issuing governments can run out of money. And we haven't understood that unemployment is because they're not spending enough net currency into the economy. And so that's what it's about. The robot issue is a separate issue. And, sorry Warren, and it reflects a dramatic lack of imagination on what socially productive activities that deserve to be paid can be out there. It's a massive number. I go running every morning. I see hundreds of jobs, well, thousands every day I go running. New jobs.
Now, you might hear us be saying the government can do this, the government can do that. We've got a lot of government in this thing, which is true. But it's because the currency itself is a coercive monopoly, public monopoly. And once you've introduced a monopoly, the idea of things being settled by the free market it doesn't exist anymore. The economics professors teach, versus monopoly, oligopoly, and then free market. You don't have, monopoly means there aren't free markets, and that's true. And so in any market will then operate under the institutional structure set up by the government. There's no way around it once you've got this coercive taxation. And if you don't have coercive taxation, you don't have a public sector that can have a military and defend itself, that can have a legal system, that can, if you want any of these things, you've given up this whole idea of any kind of free market. It's required that, everything's going to be within this monopoly that's been set up. Okay, it's the antithesis of competitive markets. You can set them up to exist within it, but you can't, step back and leave anything to the free, because you've taken it away with your taxation, which is a necessity for, human civilization. So,
okay. Right, last question.
Oh, I feel there's a great weight on my shoulders. This has got to be a good question. But my name is Stephen Wilkinson. I buy it. I really appreciated what you've explained to me today, because it does make a lot more sense to me now. I just want to ask one thing. You've talked about interest rates being zero, but on a sort of institutional practice side, I just wanted to know what you think about what the taxation rate should be, and who should pay the taxes, and whether there should be a progressive income tax or whether there should be sales taxes. What kind of taxes should there be on? Who should they be levied, and at what rate? That's those kind of practical questions are the things that come up in my mind when you're talking.
Well, I mean, certainly the tax system should be more progressive than it currently is. That's undoubtedly the case. Sales tax is typically highly regressive. So any indirect taxes, depending on what the taxes are imposed on, but that would be regressive. So, you can start from there, and decide, how high you can go in terms of progressivity. I mean, once upon a time, the top UK rate was 90%, something in that order. Yeah. So I don't anticipate getting that you'll ever get back to that. But there's clearly a massive problem of inequality. We know that in many, many countries. And having a more progressive tax system is one way of addressing that to some degree. And the other way is to do something about, executive salaries, which is another issue altogether.
The first point is that modern monetary theory is about macro, and the sort of issues about tax structure is not the conventional realm of macroeconomics. That's the first point. It's not saying it's not important, but it's also like asking a question, well, what should industry regulation be? They're separate areas of study. That's the first point. I'm not saying it's unimportant what you're saying. The second point is that there's this sort of progressive narrative that says we've got to tax the rich to fund public services. And that's very dominant over here. Your Shadow Chancellor talks like that.
Yeah. That's why I'm asking the question.
That's his principal narrative.
That's why I'm asking the question.
And what an understanding of modern monetary theory tells you is that's an absurd statement. Because as long as there's real resources available for sale to provision these services that you want the public sector to provide for the well-being of the population, then the government can do that. And there's sort of a philosophical view here, because once you start talking, has anyone read Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand's book?
Yeah.
This is a book about the importance of the big man, the big industrialist, and all of us are just parasites on their endeavour and productivity.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same sort of argument. You're saying we've got to tax the rich to fund these basic public services for the poor. Therefore, you're saying that the rich are somehow important. And without them, we can't have equity policies at the bottom end. Well, that's just an absurd thing for a progressive left person to say. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't be having discussions about vertical equity in the tax system. In other words, making the more progressivity and having higher income people pay more tax. But it's got nothing to do with increasing the capacity of government to fund services for the lower income groups. From my point of view, we want the top end of town. It's an Australian expression. I don't know if it's here. We want the top end of town to have less and not more, because they use that to pollute the political process. They use that to fund think tanks that are on the right. They use that to lobby governments. So I don't want them to do that as much as they are doing, and I'd rather them not do that. And so they're the sort of things that I think about. But don't ever fall into this Labor Party narrative that we've got to tax the rich to provide basic services in your health system, your education system. That's just ignorance.
Okay. Now, I can get way macro on you. So let's look in real terms. What we care more about is, apart from the influence, which we do care about, is consumption. What's the distribution of consumption rather than the distribution of income? So if you've got somebody in a one-bedroom apartment with 30 cats that's got $5 billion in the bank, so you don't need to take their money away for any purpose. They're not doing anything except feeding a bunch of cats, right? Now, if you got somebody else with no money that's a big wheeler dealer that's got a big yacht where they cut down half the rainforest for it, and he somehow bought it on credit, well, he's a problem. And taxing him it's not going to happen. It's wrong. So we've got to look at our consumption of resources. So what I look at are transactions taxes, like the income tax. What's the real cost of the income tax? And when I talked to a friend at University of Chicago in economics, and I said I thought it was about 15% of GDP, he said you might be low. Right? These are all the costs of everybody's record keeping, okay, all the government expense collecting it, all the enforcement, all the legal expense, all the people going to school to learn about it, all the people with tax havens all over the world doing things at every level. It's an enormous industry that's just the legal talent alone that could be out curing cancer, doing something useful, is staggering. It's absolutely staggering. So let's say it's 15% of GDP. So if you get rid of the income tax entirely, and I'll replace it with a property tax, 10% of the value of your property, just flat. All right, it's not progressive but just for this example. And there's a job guarantee, so nobody's going to lose their job and get thrown out of their house, like they do in Europe. They have high unemployment, then they put a property tax on, and then all the unemployed get thrown out of their houses, in the continent. So, Italy tried to do that. So, but not that. So, so now we've increased those 15%, that 15% of real GDP. Those people are now doing something else. We've got full employment policy. Where is the consumption of that 15% going? It's going to go to the lower consumption groups, the lower income groups. It's not going to go to the people on top, because they're not going to go from 3 meals a day to 5 meals a day because they've got more money or something like that. If they're flying once a month in their private jet, they're not going to fly every 2 weeks because they have more money. Okay, it doesn't affect the consumption of the highest income people at all, and probably the top 50% very little. So now the lower 50% probably aren't getting 15% of the consumption anyway. So you've pretty much doubled the real standard of living of the lower 50% of the population by eliminating the income tax, by getting rid of all the compliance costs built in. Now, if you look at the compliance costs of all the other transaction tax, like VAT and everything else, it's staggering. Okay, because 1% grows the food, 7% does the manufacturing, the rest is all in services. There's a whole lot of gains by making this thing more efficient right now. We've got a whole lot of people digging holes and then a whole lot of others filling them in at all levels. The bureaucracy has done that, and we can afford it because we're so productive. But those, I think, are enormous gains and an enormous way to raise the standard of living, without, and what happens is these people who want to do it by taxing the rich, and they're talking about in the States raising the marginal tax to 70%, they're going to it's going to be an enormous amount of political capital. It'll take them 4 or 5 years. They'll get it done. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm not against it, but it's not going to change anything. So the person making $15 million, takes home $1 million a year less. I mean, so what have you accomplished? All that. And here the opportunity is there to make a serious, change that doubles the standard of living of more than half of the population at no expense to anybody else whatsoever.
So our chair's gone, so I think that's about it.
Okay, in closing this meeting, I'd really like to extend my thanks and the thanks for Sarah and Claire to you all for coming, and of course Bill, Warren and Martin for such a stimulating, informative and enjoyable afternoon. I'm sure you'll all agree with me that you'll all be going home with something you didn't know before, and obviously give you some food for thought. I'm sure you all know, we've got it up on the screen, that GIMS has a presence on social media, and we've got a website. You'll find, if you hadn't been to our website before, we've got comprehensive resources from facts to fact sheets and links to further information, videos and books, and it also includes a growing MMT database of published academic papers accessible through Zotero, which was launched in Berlin earlier this year. As a non-profit organisation, we give our time freely as unpaid committed volunteers, and our costs are for holding such events are met by crowdfunding. And I have to say, give my thanks to all of you who have been so generous in your support, for which we thank you. We couldn't actually do this without you. If you'd like to sign up for our newsletter, you can go to our website and sign up, and that will keep you up to date with future events that we are organising. And so that's it really. To conclude, thank you all again for coming, and a safe journey to you all home. Thank you.